Hello, everyone, and welcome to the series finale of this four-part series on HIV genetic sequencing. This finale, the topic is, the title of our webinar today is Cluster Tracking is People, Community Town Hall on Molecular HIV Surveillance. So in this discussion today, we really want to present a summary of what we've discussed in this four-part series and also give you an opportunity to give some of your feedback as well. And the topic is mostly going to focus on molecular HIV surveillance, but of course we focused on HIV research in the series too, so we'll be talking about this as well. So just on this slide, to remind folks, this is part 4 of a 4-part series, so this is our series finale. It's been an amazing collaboration with lots of different folks and lots of participants from all over the country. Part 1 was really centering people living with HIV and those most vulnerable to this technology. We had 122 people on that first webinar representing folks from the Latinx community, transgender women, African American communities, folks who are vulnerable to HIV criminalization. We had representatives from the sex workers community. So it was a really great start to the webinar. Part 2 focused on the research realm. So there's a really important distinction here between research and public health. And so we kind of made that distinction there with part 2 on phylogenetics research and how HIV genetic sequencing is being used in HIV research for treatment and prevention and cure research in HIV. Part 3 we finished at the end of April. We had 71 people there, and that was focused once again on MHS, or molecular HIV surveillance, back into the public health realm. We heard from the CDC as well as from Nana Khanna from the Positive Women's Network. And it was a really interesting dialogue, really different perspectives as well. So we look forward to today's webinar. And I see there are a number of people still joining, lots of folks on the call. And we hope to hear from some of you today as well, back to this topic of cluster tracking and this community town hall on molecular HIV surveillance, where we really hope to uplift the voices once again of people living with HIV and those most vulnerable to MHS and who stand the most to benefit as well from technologies. So moving right along, again, it's been an amazing collaboration between all of these different organizations, so we really thank them right up from the front. The United States People Living with HIV Caucus, the Positive Women's Network USA, the Legacy Project, the Zero Project, Thrive SS, the Reunion Project, the International Community of Women Living with HIV North America, and Positively Trans. And representing some of those organizations today, here are your lovely discussants and leaders of today's webinar. That's me on the left. I'm Brian Manalga from the Legacy Project, which focuses on building trust and collaboration between HIV research institutions and the communities bearing the greatest burden of HIV in the United States. We also have Vanita Ray from the Positive Women's Network, USA, and we're joined with Andrew Spieldenner from the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus. So those are our 3 discussants, but I have "and you" on here as well because we want to hear from you on this webinar, especially to know how we need to move forward. And as far as the webinar housekeeping goes, this will be recorded. You can follow us on Facebook. I dropped our link right into the chat box, so you can find that in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. You can go ahead and click on that right now and follow us on Facebook so you can watch the recording, share the recording, and the slides of all 4 parts of this webinar series. A reminder that there's a webinar, or there's a survey following this webinar, so you can go ahead and fill that out if you have last comments that you'd like to share with us or follow-up questions. And lastly, as I said, we really hope to get some participation on this webinar, so you can do that in 2 ways. One is you can use the chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, but you can also raise your hand. There's a function there with a little hand icon, and if you'd like to speak, you can raise your hand, and later in the discussion section, I should be able to unmute people's lines individually, so you'll be able to contribute to the discussion. So with that, just a brief overview of what we've covered so far in the webinar. These are the main topics that we've looked at. So we started with this idea of community education because this technology is out there. People are doing HIV genetic sequencing, and we kind of had to grapple with this question of, well, what does that mean for people living with HIV and vulnerable to HIV? Should we wait for the worst to happen? And so that's one of the major questions that we've been asking over the course of the series. Another big theme that came out was how this technology is being used in two very different ways. It's the same technology, but it's being used in one way for phylogenetic studies in HIV research, but it's also being used in public health settings where we refer to it as molecular HIV surveillance, or MHS. And a lot of interest and concerns with the technology has come from this MHS portion, or the public health portion, especially looking at the role of HIV criminalization, at stigma, and other forms of discrimination that could come out of this technology. And then another theme is looking at the role of surveillance in understanding health concerns and directing resources. So how do we deal with this idea of public good versus the individual rights and needs of people who are implicated by this technology? So just some overall themes. And in a little bit, we're going to go more in depth into what we covered, some key takeaways from each of the first 3 webinars in the series. But first, before we do that, we wanted to hear from you. So I'm going to put a poll up on the screen here. And we want to know what impact we've had on folks who've been following us over the course of this series so far. So the question says, how much have you learned about HIV genetic sequencing and related issues from this series? So we just have a scale here. Did you learn a little, some, a lot, or have you not attended previously, so not applicable? So I'll just give folks a moment to fill that out, and we can share the results with folks.
Wow. Sweet.
All right, I'll just give it another couple seconds, and then we'll go to the results. All right, so there you have it. It looks like overall we have made an impact. So definitely over half if you combine, if you combine the first 3, a lot, some, or a little, we've got well over half, looks like about 80% of folks have learned something from the webinar series, with most of you saying that you've learned a lot from it. And it looks like we also have a fair number of people who haven't been with us so far. So I'm glad we're going to do this summary coming up here so we can catch everybody up in the conversation. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Vanita so she can bring us through and get everyone up to speed on what we discussed in the first webinar.
Okay. Can y'all hear me?
We can hear you great.
Okay, great. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you're at. We're thrilled that you have decided to attend all 4 of the webinars or joining us today. I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of my name is Anita Ray, if y'all don't know. Some of the key takeaways in webinar 1, which we as a woman living with HIV myself and part of communities that are already over-policed, over-surveillance, and, blamed for our HIV, we tried to frame the first discussion from a community view perspective, and we had folks from different communities that experienced some of the similar things. And some of the takeaways were that the CDC, the state, and local health departments get HIV sequences when people make these decisions with their doctors to do drug resistance testing, and that testing is done in order to determine maybe which drug you should take or not take. And so it's usually a decision you make between you and your doctor, but it ends up resulting in providing your genetic sequencing that is used in molecular surveillance. They use these sequences and other data to track clusters, and even though you hear clusters a lot, that's people. They're clusters of people with similar strains of HIV as well as their HIV-negative partners. And so It may not always happen at the CDC level, but it definitely at the community level. So that once you get your HIV resistance testing that you and your doctor decided, then that information is used in other ways. Certain populations are already over-surveilled, as I said before, antagonized and criminalized. That includes people of color, Black people like myself, people who are homeless, people of trans experience who experience multiple forms of oppression and policing, people who inject drugs, and people who engage in sex work. In other words, our mothers, daughters, fathers, sisters, brothers. And these populations have serious concerns about molecular surveillance being used against them in ways that could result in stigma, deportation, I'm going to throw in here, incarceration, and even death, or just being outed, someone coming to you that you don't know and following up about your status. So it's unclear to these populations how molecular surveillance is worth the risk of what happens once we make that deal with our doctor to get drug resistance testing. Next slide.
Great. Thanks, Vanita. So really good summary of the first webinar. Again, once centering the voices that really matter the most in this, which are the people that are most implicated. So thanks for pointing that out, that when we refer to clusters, as the title of today's webinar implies, we're talking about people. So I wanted to just give a little overview and summary of what happened in webinar 2. So what we did in webinar 2 was really stepped back from the public health arena and zoomed in on what's happening in research, especially with NIH-funded research. And so there's this whole field of research within HIV called HIV phylogenetics research. And it's a really different situation from the public health arena, where in public health, like Vanita said, people living with HIV, they get their sequences from their doctor, and that's the sequences that go to CDC and health departments. It's a different use of the technology in research. So in research, it's the same sequencing technology, but what happens is people opt in to the research. There's a study that's out there, and people living with HIV will opt into a study. They get informed consent, in which you would go through, the study staff would go through with participants how this technology works, and they would then give their samples, and the sequences would go to the researchers. And of course, data protections apply. So those data are protected through encryption, through certificates of confidentiality, and so that's how it works in terms of getting the sequences in the context of research. And what do the researchers then do with those sequences? They, as Carl Diefenbach explained on webinar part 2, the director of the Division of AIDS at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, he explained that researchers then use those sequences to study the evolution of HIV, which he described as HIV's greatest strength, is how it evolves so rapidly. But researchers then use that evolution and turn it on its head to use it against HIV and conceive of ways to defeat it, to defeat the virus. And here I've listed some studies where HIV genetic sequencing has been used. So like HPTN052, the partner studies, opposites attract. And these are all studies that use phylogenetic sequencing leading up to what we all know as true, is that undetectable equals untransmittable. So just one example of how phylogenetic sequencing is used in HIV research. Dr. Diefenbach also explained that current methodologies using phylogenetics cannot reliably determine the direction of transmission. So for example, you can't use phylogenetics to say that person A was the source of HIV to person B. And he showed some data that people have tried to do that, and I think he said like over 60% of the time that fails, so there's no reliable prediction. However, we did a survey and asked people if they believe that or not, and most believe that phylogenetics can determine direct transmission. And there's kind of some semantics going on here as well between direct transmission, directionality, direction of transmission. And so overall, I think it's important to recognize that we're kind of taking a snapshot here where right now the methodologies can't determine person A to person B, but maybe one day they can. And also there's a lot of distrust currently of this technology where most people believe that it can determine direction. And that's really important to know that people have this belief in terms of folks participating in the research while fearing HIV criminalization and stigma and other things. However, the NIH, as we discussed in part 2, is meaningfully involving people from affected communities in study design, data security, community engagement, legal guidance, communication. So I think that's another difference that we've noticed between research and public health, is that in the research realm, we have this long history of community advisory boards and community scientific committees where people get to put their input into what happens in research. And both Vanita and I have been on a committee of the NIH that is actually soon hopefully publishing a paper on ethical recommendations for phylogenetics research. So a lot of input from communities is going into this initiative. However, despite even all of that effort, there remains a large amount of historical distrust of biomedical research, and for very valid reasons. So we need to continue to weigh the potential negative impacts against scientific gains, especially for communities who still have that historical distrust of biomedical research. And phylogenetics research and public health sometimes overlap. So we're making this distinction between the two, but sometimes there is a gray area. For example, research that uses public health data. So we need to discuss what happens in that gray area. And then it also became clear over the course of this series that this distinction we're making between research and public health is not clear to most people. Most people hear MHS or HIV genetic sequencing, and they think of the public health arena. They think of HIV criminalization and the surveillance that's happening with this cluster tracking. So most folks, it seems, aren't really clear on what's happening with the research and how it's different from molecular HIV surveillance. So with that, we wanted to take a pause. It was a lot of information, and come back to a question for you, the audience, which was, after hearing more about HIV genetic sequencing in research, not molecular HIV surveillance, but just in that research realm that I was just describing, the question is, how concerned are you that HIV research studies using this phylogenetic technology could harm people living with and or vulnerable to HIV? Are you not concerned at all with the research? Are you a little concerned? Are you concerned, or are you very concerned? So we'll give you a couple of seconds rather, to fill that out. Looks like folks are filling it out quickly. All right, so I'll close the poll here.
Wow.
Very even split. Yeah, almost exactly even. Yeah, which is really interesting to know that even with the protections in place and all the community input, it's still very true that there is a distrust of research, and not everyone is as comfortable with this technology being used, even in the research context. So really interesting split across the folks on the call today.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah. So with that, I think Andy's going to talk to us a little bit about what happened in the last webinar.
Sure. Thanks, Brian. And thanks, Vanita. So I wanted to summarize. I'm Andy Spieldenner, and I'm currently the Vice Chair of the United States People Living with HIV Caucus. This has been a great partnership. I echo that. And I wanted to kind of summarize what happened in our third webinar, where Nana Khanna, the Executive Director of the Positive Women's Network, and Dr. Eugene McCrae from the CDC, the HAP Division of HIV/AIDS Prevention, I think. Dr. McCrae and Nana talked about MHS as a public health concern in the United States, and so we got an overview of CDC's HIV prevention program, And one of the key elements of the CDC's HIV prevention program and the HIV epidemic that we've seen in the news, that we've seen touted at HRSA and some other places, that molecular HIV surveillance is in fact one of the legs of the plan. It's definitely something that's been invested in and something that the federal government is moving forward with. So we got an overview of how it works and kind of how it works at the CDC level, working with health departments, and what its intent is. And really looking at how molecular HIV surveillance is meant to really connect those of us living with HIV to care, who are out of care, and to look at where HIV prevention services need to be better targeted by location and by population group. We got an overview of how the CDC protects its data, and it was a very extensive process by which the data is anonymized when it goes to CDC for sequencing. And we also had some concerns that were raised. Nana Khanna had brought up questioning how much community engagement has actually happened at the health department side. There have been some listening sessions that are not necessarily community engagement that we've heard about. We've also seen at least one health department said that HIV sequences have been subpoenaed for HIV criminalization cases, and that and the other thing is that networks of people living with HIV, we remain heavily concerned because there's no consent. Generally, when your personal data is used for healthcare, for different kinds of services, we have to provide consent. Because this is a surveillance process, we do not provide consent for surveillance. We don't need, the CDC doesn't need to, and the health department doesn't need to. Surveillance is considered a public good. But there's also concern that at the health department level that we have personal information disclosed, that every state law is different when it comes to data protection and criminalization, and that we're concerned as PLHIV networks about further harm to particularly vulnerable groups, including people with trans experience, immigrants, homeless people who are homeless, as well as people of color. And then finally, they had a good discussion about how the data is used for public health purposes rather than the research purposes. I think that pretty much sums up the third one. So yeah, the focus is really on MHS for public health. Anything else?
I think that covers it. We just had the same question for you about MHS that we had for phylogenetic HIV research. So same question is, how concerned are you that public health use of molecular HIV surveillance could harm people living with and or vulnerable to HIV? And same scale here. Are you not at all concerned about MHS? Are you a little concerned with it, concerned, or very concerned? We'll see if we get as even a spread on this one as we did on the previous one. All right, so actually still a pretty even spread with a fair number of folks saying they're not at all concerned. Looks like the majority of folks, however, are at least a little concerned and all the way up to very concerned with the use of MHS and the potential harms for people living with and or vulnerable to HIV. So thanks everyone for your participation so far. I think we're going to go back now to Andy, who's going to tell us a little bit about today's topic. Andy, are you there?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. I was brilliant, but I was on mute.
I believe it.
So today what we really wanted to do was not only kind of summarize some of the concerns that have been raised on all three webinars, but really look at specifically what those concerns were for various audiences. So when we talk about health departments, when we talk about CDC, and we talk about our own community. And I think it's really important that we think about how those three players are different, how those three actors are different in NHS, and what kinds of concerns we would have. After that, we're going to turn it over to everyone else to ask questions about what are some concerns, what can we do to move forward. So that's what's on the agenda today, folks. Next slide. So across all three webinars, there were several concerns around health departments, and the biggest one was community engagement. And so a lot of health departments, some health departments are really good at community engagement, and others don't have the resources for it, don't have a history with their local community, or the way they've done community engagement has been erratic or has focused on one particular segment of the community. So for instance, there might be 2 people living with HIV that the health department regularly contacts for things, and their expectation is that those 2 people know a huge network rather than involving groups of people living with HIV. And constantly needing to kind of, when we talk about community engagement, we're also talking about making sure that those most marginalized are lifted up and being able to participate. And so those communities, the ones that we're all part of, we need to know how MHS is being done. We need to know how the health department is doing it, and we also need to be notified that MHS is being done. One of the issues that was raised, molecular HIV surveillance has been going on for over a year now. I live in San Diego, and this department pioneered it, and so it's been going on in San Diego for about 10 years. And one of the things about what I've seen in San Diego, the health department has very good relationships with the community and constantly does different activities and spends a lot of energy and resources towards keeping in touch with the community. So, not all health departments can do that or have done that. And I think that's something that we need to raise up, that's a concern, is how is community engagement being done, and what is our bare minimum knowledge that we need. Similarly, as health departments identify clusters, as we've seen, some health departments turn to the media to announce that there's a cluster or to identify the existence of one in the area. And, it's important when we think of this, and one of the reasons we called this, clusters or people is because, number one, I'm a nerd and I like Soylent Green, but I think Barb Cardell actually coined that term, that molecular clusters are people. But I think when we use the cluster language, we're forgetting that. And when we think about people first language, the reason why people first language is really important is because it indicates how inclusive people are. And so as we talk about people, people first language actually helps people be sympathetic towards human beings and see people as human beings. So for instance, one of the examples I use often when I talk about people first language is when we talk about people who are homeless, there's a very different, people get a very different connotation when we say people who are homeless or people who are erratically housed than if you say the homeless, which kind of refers to people as this kind of mass, faceless mass that we never have to, we can't fix this issue. Whereas if we say people who are erratically housed or people who are homeless, you see that the connotation is very different. And I think that when health departments engage the media about the existence of a cluster, we really want, as a community, we want health departments to use people first language as much as possible, because it does exclude people and it dehumanizes them to call us clusters. And I think it's important to think about, especially in HIV, where we've, as a community, we have the Denver Principles, which starts out talking about what we call ourselves, and that we're not patients and we're not victims, we're people living with HIV. So I think similar to that, some of the concerns for health departments that I heard from our community discussions that Vanita and Brian and I went over, and we were like, what are the key issues? One of the key issues that we heard about health departments was really thinking about how surveillance is handled, how investigations are handled. some of us, I'm not going to say who, so that's me actually. So some of us have been targeted investigations for other STIs. So I've been involved in like 2 syphilis investigations. And in both cases, the disease intervention specialist who came from the health department, in both cases, within 20 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, threatened to bring the police in because I refused to give names. And I think we really need to think about how surveillance is handled. In my case, I'm obnoxious and I yelled at them and told them they had to leave. But other people might not know their rights and might be scared at the threat of law enforcement being called in. And not only that, but for some of us, that's a deep threat when a government person says, I'm going to call I'm going to call the police. And we've seen over and over again, particularly as Black Lives Matter emerges as a movement, we've seen over and over again how important it is to be careful how we invoke the use of law enforcement. One concern I've heard that was raised was how do health departments, how can they adequately conduct MHS effectively if there's a lack of resources? So some health departments are very large and have robust surveillance teams and have robust community engagement programs, but some don't. And there's some concerns there that will jurisdictions that have less developed health departments, will they be able to actually conduct molecular HIV surveillance? Similar to that, while the health departments are funded to do molecular HIV surveillance, they're not funded to fix structural issues. So one of the rationales for molecular HIV surveillance, according to the CDC, is to look at how there are gaps in each region's treatment cascade. So the treatment cascade is the public health measure by which we see diagnosing people with HIV, getting us into care, getting us into treatment, maintaining treatment, and being able to move the community towards viral suppression. And as the molecular HIV surveillance is rolled out, the idea is that it would see exactly where people fall out of the treatment cascade. And the challenge with that is, as health departments identify challenges, are they then resourced to fix the structural issues that created the gap? And so, for instance, if we look at people who are homeless, for instance, homelessness is an issue that has a lot of different roots, and it's got a lot of challenges to address people who, the challenges of people who are homeless. So if we identify a cluster that is erratically housed, does the health department, is the goal of that to then just give people medication? And how useful is that, considering that, we know how law enforcement regularly sweeps communities, particularly gentrifying communities, to move people who are homeless out of them. And so with that in mind, how is the health department supposed to address the core issues there? And I think that that's something that needs to be thought about, and it was raised several times in different ways throughout the webinars. And finally, probably something that we've heard over and over and over again was about protection of data at the health department side. I know people that work at health departments that have had to testify in criminalization cases, and that would just be horrendous. But, if you think about it, if they could be subpoenaed for those cases, it's not too big of a stretch that, how is the data going to be maintained? How is that confidentiality going to be maintained? And as we move forward with this surveillance system. Next slide.
Yeah.
Anita?
Okay, so you can help me out. So from a CDC perspective, and Andy and I have had the benefit of actually doing some, having conversations with CDC around molecular surveillance in the last couple of months that has given us a little insight. But some of the things that we've talked about from CDC or that we'd like to see is stop using molecular surveillance until we resolve the issues of how to protect people living with HIV, marginalized communities, communities of color. We've been to listening. I've been in a number of listening sessions where we could raise the issues but never a response, and I've never had a response back, and I've talked to health departments here in Houston and other places of how do you address some of our issues. The fact that we're people living with HIV didn't eliminate my issue, my right to privacy, my right to feel safe, and other things. So we know that the individual states have their own laws around when and how to share data. So that's not a CDC function. But until we resolve some of these issues, one of our recommendations is stop using it until we resolve some of these issues on how to protect and resolve and respond to some of our issues. We also talked about a resource in health departments to adequately implement molecular surveillance at that point, and do real community engagement, cultural competence in surveillance. Approaching every community is not the same. Communities that are approached, Black communities versus Latinx versus trans communities, sexual, there's a lot of different, and I'm going to call it unintended consequences, but if we already know this going in and we think public health trumps whatever issue, and I did say that, didn't mean to, that those individual privacy or other kinds of law enforcement needs issues. Community engagement must go beyond your planning council and your planning groups. Those do not represent community engagement just the same way listening sessions do not. And then in surveillance, cultural competency in the way that we do surveillance or investigation around communities. I'm in the South. That looks very different than it might look in the West or in the North or somewhere else. We want guidelines for health departments on community engagement. I think I just mentioned this, the way that the media is involved and the investigations are handled. Andy, I'm sorry, you can go ahead and finish. I'm getting carried away.
No, it's fine. You're fine.
Okay.
I think we also want to, we'd like CDC to actually come out against HIV criminalization. CDC does have a 2017 publication looking at that there was no prevention effect of HIV criminalization laws, but it also, we haven't seen CDC actually just say they're against HIV criminalization. And I think that the root of a lot of fear involved in molecular HIV surveillance, a lot of the fears that we have as people living with HIV are specific to criminalization. There are other fears, but the most prominent one is criminalization, which affects us differently depending on the jurisdiction. So some people, some district attorneys are very prosecution happy about it. I know of a DA in Florida who has 5 criminalization cases open right now. And, I think that it would be a strong statement for CDC to be against it. And then the HHS 2030 and the epidemic plan to think about how the 2030 and the epidemic plan think about ways to incorporate some of these structural issues that we've raised into that plan moving forward.
And I want to say one other thing about criminalization. Folks can tell us, and we've heard and learned about phylogenetics and this issue, you can't show directionality and all this stuff, but on the ground there's still rampant fear that this science, what it does, just being outed, even if you got to have your privacy invaded before you can prove that it's not you. And there's a perception on the ground that's real for people that the science does show directionality, that it can show who gave what to who or who might have been involved. So perception is real. And if you don't have the same skin in the game of people who could be implicated in some of this, there's no way you can understand what it feels like.
I also think that when we talk about you can't prove directionality, realistically as a defense, you would have to, somebody who's being prosecuted would have to pay for their own epidemiological expert to come in to defend them. And when we talk about most criminalization cases, we're talking about public defenders, and we're talking about people that may not have the, probably won't have the money to pay for an epidemiological expert to come in to show, quote unquote, to the judge and to the jury that there's no directionality proven through this science. And that was raised by the Colorado Health Department in one session that I was in, and I really appreciated the thoughtfulness of that point being raised, because the criminal justice system does unfairly impact poor people. People who are poor, and I think that that's something that when we talk about you can't prove directionality, but the reality is that in court, the defendant would have to pay for somebody to come in to say that as an expert.
And let me say this: in Texas, we have 2 men that I'm aware of right now that are in prison for spitting while positive. And because there was, and the CDC has put out something about spit does not transmit, but there was one expert or someone who was found to say there's a 1.00 whatever percent chance of transmission, and these men are doing extensive, really a long time for, and both of them happen to be poor people, poor black men, but also you could find someone who could say that, and if we know already the science shows us that, why are we dealing with someone in prison right now? So the fear is real on the ground, and I'll leave it at that.
So, we one of the reasons why we're doing this webinar series is because we really are concerned about our own communities. We want to engage folks, and we want to be able to have a discussion. We realized when molecular HIV surveillance first kind of surfaced as something that was happening, it was the summer before last, I think. And we were at HIV is Not a Crime Training Academy, and we were informed this was happening. And we held a quick meeting, and we thought maybe 10 people would show up. And instead, it was about 45, 50 people, standing room only, both PLHIV activists and academics, as well as attorneys were in the room, and all of us trying to figure out what this surveillance system did, how it operated, and how it affected us and how it could affect us. Moving to this community engagement webinar, we realized that the discussion needs to happen in the community, and that we can't just rely on health departments, that we as a community have to do the education ourselves. So sometimes we simplify the science, sometimes we problematize the operations of things, but that's really because we're trying to talk about our communities. And as one of our friends and allies and colleagues in the struggle, Scott Schott, has said before, why do we want to wait until this is a worst case scenario? We need to look at how these systems can be operationalized and neutralize potential problems before they happen, because these are people's lives. So with that being said, when we talk about for our own communities, some of the issues that were raised, we really want to encourage people to educate others. You should know that this system is happening. Your friends should know the system is happening. Your aid service provider should know that this system is happening, and they should know how it affects us. What are you afraid of? What are you not afraid of? Do you have friends that, that are unaware that this is happening? Also, another thing to think about is you need to talk to your doctor. Find out when they're doing your phylogenetic sequencing, because it's no longer neutral. That blood sample is being used in other ways, and so it's really important to talk to your doctor and your clinician about this and about any concerns you might have. One of the things that I think we need to be, as a community, a lot better about is not telling people to use law enforcement, when they think that they've been exposed to HIV, or that they want to get revenge on, they know who gave them HIV and they want to get revenge. I think we need to be really cautious as a community about those cases, and we need to discourage that. I think that encouraging law enforcement in criminalization cases just presents a problem for everybody. It's using a system of oppression that will ruin somebody's life. And the other thing is that one of the things that's concerned me, and this is something that I see on Grindr and other apps, is there are some people out there that are like putting pictures of people up in different profiles to say these people have HIV and they're lying about it. And I've seen this all over the country in different communities, that there's a group of people who have taken upon themselves to publicize people's HIV status. And that's not cool. It's really can stigmatize people and mess people's lives up. Before I was out about my HIV status, somebody did that to me, and I remember feeling like my world was over, that I could not, appear anywhere. And I think that we need, as a community, we need to kind of discourage people from publicizing people's HIV status. I think it's people's choices to disclose, and we need to stand by that principle. Anything you want to add, Benita?
No, and I want to say this, as a HIV community, especially people living with HIV, we understand that some people who are now living with HIV feel that they were victims and were victimized, and we are not discounting those feelings and how you may feel about how you acquired it. We all did. But what we are saying is that there's a structural and systemic issue here, that when we bring law enforcement in, we all are subject to greater consequences than just the person that person might have been trying to direct their, direct some of their anger at for what they did to them. So I understand that, but law enforcement in these cases is not always our friend, because once we're all in the same boat, it could happen to any one of us.
There was one of the people that we know that survived criminalization and was prosecuted and has since had an appeal. One of the things that happened was the gay men that were part of the investigation, the gay man that came forward, actually regretted doing it because he didn't realize it would turn into this gigantic nightmare that the young man in the case would end up being considered a sex offender for years. That he did not realize when he started the process the impact it would have on everybody. And I think that's something we really need to think about is, as a community, we do honor each other's feelings, and we do acknowledge that some people feel very victimized in the process, but we need to be careful about how we utilize institutions that do systemically discriminate.
Are we moving on? Have you already used this, asking your health department how they're engaging? No. Yeah. So some health departments, I know mine where I live is doing some. I've been to meetings. I know they're all extremely sensitive, competent, but, it doesn't hurt to go to your own local health department and find out if they're using MHS and how they're using it and how they're engaging it, and get your questions answered. This is something you can do at home. Take some folks with you and find out, is your local health department engaging in molecular surveillance? One of the other things we're going to talk about, we mentioned a little while ago, is supporting a demand for a moratorium on the use of molecular surveillance until we could feel a little safer, and so till some of the concerns of the HIV community are addressed, or at least responded to, and at least attempted to address some of the fears and real concerns of people on the ground who could be subjected to surveillance and policing, especially we saw in the new HHS plan, the 48 counties. I can guarantee you almost, and this is my statement, that those are probably Black and brown communities. And so where the surveillance and policing is happening is in communities that are already experiencing this. So I would, one of the suggestions and one of the things we've talked about is go ask your health department. Do they know how to engage communities of whether they're black, brown, or whatever, and what they're doing. And then supporting the demand for a moratorium until we feel like we can answer some of these questions. And, with the HHS plan, when it came out, and I look at it now, recognize the greater impact on communities of color. That plan don't have race nowhere, but those 48 counties I know are where the epidemic. I'm a black woman. We represent 6% of the epidemic. It's not because we have bad behavior. There are structural issues going on here. And so recognize that there's greater impact. It is not those communities' fault. There is systemic and structural issues that exist, and that we could talk about at another time, that make HIV more prevalent in some communities than others. Poverty is one of the greater predictors. When we're talking about issues of stigma, please recognize stigma isn't the same in every community. It's multi-layered. It's not an apple. It's an onion. So there could be stigma of the disease, stigma of the race, stigma of the sexual orientation, the gender identity, discrimination, racism. There's so many things to think about when you recognize the impact on communities of color, and then the structural issues that put people in the positions that we are in, whether income inequality, lack of access to culturally competent health care, fear of going to the doctor because of fear of deportation or other kinds of consequences.
I think also when we talk about that greater impact on communities of color, one of the reasons why we did our first webinar specifically on people to talk on specific having leaders from certain populations step forward to talk about how policing happens on them and on their communities is because, a lot of the HIV criminalization reform efforts have focused on the law, but because, as people of color, we know that we are policed differently. As a queer person, we know we're policed differently, and HIV criminalization laws are part of the problem, but the other challenge that we have in our communities is the policing and the ways in which police are weaponized and used in our communities. And I think that when we open up these discussions, we need to be deliberate in addressing that fact and involve and be able to open up those conversations. I think some of the other things to look at with our own communities is to look at how do we address structural issues, the structural issues that Vanita brought up, and how do we demand for those structural issues to be in these plans, as Vanita said, around the epidemic plan, which I am not reading on purpose because it will disturb me. And finally, we want, for our own communities, we want people to know that genetic sequencing occurs when you do resistance testing, and to be conscious about that, because that's a standard of care in this country for people living with HIV. And so, we do believe in working in partnership with our clinicians and our healthcare providers, and so being able to be knowledgeable about when this occurs.
Yes. So we're at the point where we've given you some facts, we've given you some opinion, some of our lived experience concerns. We'd like to hear from you. What are some of your concerns? Was this what you were doing, Brian? What is your relationship with your health department like? And Brian, I think you will facilitate this.
Yeah, for sure. So I do have one question here already, but just to remind folks how to participate, there's two ways. You can either type your question or your comment into the chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, or you can also click the little hand icon to raise your hand if you want me to unmute your phone line so that you can just use your voice and participate in the discussion that way. So with that, I will just read the one question that we have so far, and it's a question for Andy and Vanita. Eve wants to know, what does community engagement mean to you? What would be enough? And what do you want to come out of the community engagement process?
Ooh. Andy, you or me?
That's a great question, Eve.
It really is. Do you want to answer or you want me? Because it is a good question.
I think you've hit one of the nails on the head, Eve, in terms of what one of the challenges has been, is I do believe that when we talk about community engagement, it's important to have the same definitions. As people living with HIV, one of the principles by which I do my work is the meaningful involvement of people with HIV, or MIPA, or the greater involvement of people with HIV. And I believe that one of the ways in which we best engage the HIV community is through MIPA. So we have to be meaningfully involving people, which means, creating meeting spaces that are safe for people to participate, that, that have different kinds of languages and disabilities accounted for, including people who might be active drug users or people who have mental health challenges, and being able to facilitate meetings in ways that are culturally responsive to those needs, as well as be able to educate in ways that are culturally responsive and respectful. I think that for me, community engagement means that people are able to say no, and that people are able to raise questions, that they know what questions to raise. I've been to many sessions where people believe it's community engagement because they're explaining things, but they're explaining things in highly scientific terminology, or they're dismissing people's concerns because of things like, well, we can't prove directionality. Like that's not listening to the concern. And I think that that's something that's really important, is that fears that are on the ground don't go away by saying they're not true. So I think community engagement to me is a longer process than doing a focus group or even hosting a webinar. I think our numbers have been high on here because we've, as organizations, we've worked really hard to make sure that that people knew this was happening, and I think it really spoke to a need in the community. Vanita?
Yeah, I have one. And I think real community engagement occurs before the practice is initiated. So real meaningful, and what Andy was just talking about, MIPA, or meaningful involvement. Meaningful involvement means that we have a chance to change the outcome, that we have a chance to see our opinions, thoughts included in the final product. It doesn't mean someone came to the community, told us what they were going to do, heard us, and then went out and did it. It happened before the process. And when is it enough? That's really hard to say, but I would say it goes beyond those typical bodies that make it easy. If we're dealing in the Black community, there could be some announcement on a radio station of a meeting that's being held in a community, or partnering with a community organization that has access to the community, not what I consider low-hanging fruit of, we know we already got these certain people together. Here in Houston, I think we're 4 million or something. We have a 38-person body planning council, great size, but if you go there and just get engagement, that's 38 people, clearly informed people, but I think real community engagement is broader. Is it in Spanish? It can the Spanish-speaking community gets it, but and understand what's going on. But for me, real community engagement happens before something is initiated and folks have a chance to influence the outcome of whatever is being considered. It doesn't mean we might get everything we want, but it definitely helps when you've heard us come back, say, we heard you, these are our issues, this is what we're coming up with, what do you think? It's a process. It's not just an event.
Great. So I don't have any other questions coming right now. There may be some on the way, but I know we have another half hour scheduled, but typically, I think folks tend to block their time in increments of 1 hour. So while other folks are thinking of questions, I wanted to give Andy and Vanita a chance to just talk about what might be coming next, and folks feel free to keep raising your hand or typing questions in.
So some of the things that we are considering, you've heard us mention moratorium a couple of times. We have a kind of draft document that could come out that folks could sign on to express our desire for some of our issues to be addressed, and for molecular surveillance to be halted until some of our issues are addressed. That's one way. We're also talking about developing frequently asked questions if folks, could submit some that are the distinctions between public health versus research or what it is and what it isn't. When does it occur? How is it used? So those are a couple of the ideas that we had. Andy, you want to add anything to that?
I think as we move forward on this, I do think that we'll definitely be emailing people who've registered for these webinars, as well as provide this data in other places. I know that Legacy is keeping the recordings of all 4 webinars on their Facebook page. So if you're interested or want to catch up on them, or you want to share them with other people, that's a great way for you to kind of spread the word. And I think that that's something that, particularly, if you know somebody who doesn't know about it, to share it, I think would be really important. I think as we move forward, we're all available, to continue the conversations, and to, as an organization, as our organizations, we're very constituent driven, and so we really want to hear from you if there are any concerns or if things aren't happening. Brian put into the chat box the way that non-Facebook users like myself can access the recording, so I really appreciate that, Brian. Thank you.
And in other conferences, you're probably going to hear this subject brought up. If not, bring it up. Talk about it. Even if you're supportive of it, educate folks to why you are or why you're not. I mean, I just think that until the last 2 years, I had not heard conversations about it. As Brian mentioned, there is going to be a document release from the research side on ethical guidelines. We'd love to see something done on the public health side, which we see more of an impact.
And we do know that CDC is producing more guidelines and documents. CDC rolled this out in good faith, and the issues that were raised surprised CDC also. And so this is also a learning process. We've seen our partners in public health struggle with what kinds of guidelines are needed, what toolkits are needed, and really being able to develop those forward. So we're going to see more on this. We do recognize that this is part of HRSA's and the epidemic plan, and so moving forward, we need to keep our eyes on this particular ball.
So we like y'all to be ready if we, if we end up having to do another webinar or send out a notice, or if the CDC, the guidelines that if they develop new guidelines that we could share it with folks who've registered for these webinars. The whole intent is to have an informed HIV community and an informed ally community to what's going on and what people are doing and the conversations that we're having about this issue.
Great. Well, I do see one person has a hand raised, so I'm going to unmute that line. So let's see. Actually, Ron, if you can, in the chat box, send me the phone number that you're dialing in on, I can unmute your line. If you do that for you. It looks like you're dialed in on a phone, so I just need to know which line you're calling from.
Okay, I want to thank all of our presenters, especially from the community, who took the time and exposed themselves to talk about this issue.
Hello?
Hey, there's Ron.
Hi. Just a quick comment and a question. This is Ron Simmons in Washington, D.C., and I serve on several committees, including the CAB of the CFAR here in Washington, D.C., and the Center for AIDS, Research in Washington, D.C. The CAB, the CFAR, and I'm on the Community Advisory Board. And so they gave us, the health department has given us presentations on MHS, and our concern was that there were no legal protections that indeed this data could be used in terms of the criminal justice system, and what kind of legal protections were there. And so they told us that there were none. There was no language in D.C. or Virginia. There was some language in Maryland, but we didn't get the exact details. So basically, I guess my question is, one of the things we're doing here in D.C. is we're trying to, indeed, as a community, come up with language, legal language, to present to our city council that will protect people from MHS in terms of it being used for criminal justice, and or I should say criminal injustice. And I guess my question is, are other cities, two things, are other cities doing this, that is, trying to come up with language, or do you know of an effort anywhere to come up with language that can be shared by other cities and other jurisdictions that will protect the people? Is that clear?
Yeah, I understand.
Yes.
Okay.
Hey, Ron, nice to talk to you.
Yeah.
Nice
talking
with you.
I know him.
Yeah. Ron Simmons and I went to the same graduate school, graduate program. So, Ron, great question, and we applaud your efforts. We'd love to know more about your efforts in terms of the arguments that you're building. I have not heard of any jurisdictions being proactive in developing specific codes, but I'm not 100% clear about which health departments would be moving forward on that. Benita? Brian?
Yeah, well, this is something, and Brian can answer too. So you're in a unique situation. I used to live in D.C., so you're going to the city council, whatever. Most other places, this kind of stuff is controlled by state law. Like in 2015 here, we had a senator, one of our state senators, introduce a bill because all medical records are confidential. Well, they wanted to change the language, and we have a stronger law than HIPAA that we don't share even with law enforcement subpoena. Well, they wanted to change the language to say certain tests can be shared upon a subpoena, and I want you to guess which test they were going to make an exception to that law. Is for HIV testing for someone being brought up on criminal charges, even though we don't have an HIV specific statute in Texas, but our folks are being prosecuted under general criminal laws. So some of this has to be, I think, at the state level, and I know there's a few other states that have, I don't know that they've come up with MHS specific language, but one of the challenges I find with that, and I think DC is a little different, is it's the heavy lift of the HIV community. If we could get partners to do that too, would be much easier. But it's the lift of the HIV community to go to their state legislatures, and not something we can't do, but to introduce language that might that could protect folks around molecular surveillance. So I applaud you, Ron, for what you're doing. I just don't know of any others. I know we just keep looking and trying to fight when they're kind of bringing up language in our laws, state laws, that would subject us to any kind of prosecution. But there's been nothing on molecular surveillance till now.
Yeah, and this is Brian. I know Ron too. Ron, we met at NASM. I was in your Bodeme session. But I'm glad you brought up the question because actually there's a publication that I don't think we've mentioned yet on the series, this webinar series, and it is specific to MHS. The title of the publication is called Ethical Considerations for a Public Health Response Using Molecular HIV Surveillance Data.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, the corresponding authors are David Evans and Nanette Benbow, and they convened a stakeholders meeting in Chicago in 2017. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and just drop this in the chat box right now. It's just the link to the PDF, so everyone can go ahead and access that document. But it's a really good one, and actually we've based some of our approach for the research part of it that Vanita and I talked about. We've based some of that approach on what was done in Chicago in 2017 for this MHS publication. So definitely check that out. It has some really some good guidance, and it includes a lot of language on criminalization as well.
And please share with us what you do, Ron. We want to know.
All right. Well, I don't see any other questions. I just see that Chris Sardina has joined us, so welcome,
Hey,
Chris.
Chris.
And actually, there's Chris as one of these pictures on the slide. So we just really wanted to thank everyone who's contributed to this conversation so far. These are all the official speakers on the webinar. So we have Marco Castro-Bojorquez, we have Dr. Carl Diefenbach from the NIH, Nana Khanna, Octavia Lewis, Dr. Eugene McCrae from the CDC, myself, Brian Manalga, Vanita Ray, Chris Sardina, Andy Spieldenner, and Robert Suttle. So lots of great speakers, but plus all of you who've been on the calls, participating, filling out the surveys, sharing the webinars, sharing the recordings and the slides, getting the information out there. We're all a part of this, and so we want to thank all the speakers especially, but definitely all of those of you who've been participating and with us, and hopefully will stay with us as we figure out what to do next with regard to this technology, both in research and in public health. So any closing comments from Vanita and Andy?
I think I said it all.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody, and I think, and I really appreciate being able to work with Brian and Vanita on this. And I think that it's these kinds of collaborations are kind of what makes community engagement happen. And so I would encourage people to continue having the conversations locally as well as with their constituent membership organizations. And we pledge in the HIV caucus to continue having this conversation and keeping our eyes on this ball.
And I would say, and I think our emails or addresses are somewhere where they're on the registration piece or something. Any organization, health department, and we're in touch with CDC that wants to talk, work with us, we are definitely willing to do that. We will bring the perspective we bring, but we definitely are willing to have some conversations that present a semi-equal bargaining power. We're not just that we're there to tell you and you're not to respond. We'd love to have some conversations with folks who are doing this and want to know more, or who are trying to see how to do this better or how to engage the community better. We may not know it all, but we'd love to have those conversations with y'all. So please feel free to reach any of us. I'm sure. I know I'm speaking for Andy and Brian. I'm sure they'd be willing to have the conversation.
Absolutely. And you have our contact information there on the screen, so please feel free to use that. But in the meantime, we look forward to hearing from you. We will be in touch with publications and other information as they come out. But otherwise, just wanted to give one last thank you to my co-presenters, Dr. Andrew Spieldenner and Vanita Ray, for
I'm a
great
doctor
close
too.
to this 4-part series. All right, Dr. Ray.
I've never used it. Thank you. No, I'm just kidding. All right, thank you. And Brian, it was a pleasure working with you, and Andy, as usual.
Yeah, thank you both. This is awesome.
All right.
And thank you all for attending.
All right.
Take
Have
care,
a good day,
everyone.
everybody.
Bye-bye.